The Grand Plaza's evening shift had been quiet until the homeless-looking man entered the lobby, his presence immediately creating tension among the well-dressed guests who'd paid premium prices for luxury accommodations. Madison Parker watched from behind the reception desk, already formulating the polite but firm refusal she'd deliver to remove him before other guests complained. What she saw was a liability, a threat to the hotel's atmosphere that needed immediate resolution. What she didn't see was a Silver Star recipient whose courage under fire had saved an entire platoon during the Tet Offensive. The Grand Plaza Hotel had maintained its reputation for luxury and exclusivity in downtown Seattle for over 60 years, its marble lobby and crystal chandeliers creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that attracted business travelers, wealthy tourists, and dignitaries who expected nothing less than pristine accommodations and impeccable service. Located in the heart of the city's business district, the hotel had hosted everyone from Fortune 500 executives to foreign diplomats, building a clientele that valued discretion, comfort, and the assurance that their stay would be free from any unpleasant disruption. Madison Parker had worked the evening desk for 3 years, taking pride in her ability to maintain the hotel's standards while providing exceptional service to guests who appreciated attention to detail. At 26, she understood that her role extended beyond simply checking people in and out. She was a guardian of the Grand Plaza's reputation, ensuring that only appropriate guests were welcomed into the establishment's exclusive environment. Her training had emphasized the importance of reading situations quickly, identifying potential problems before they escalated, and protecting the comfort of paying customers who expected a certain level of atmosphere and security. The November evening had been typically busy with corporate travelers and upscale tourists, the kind of clientele that made Madison's job straightforward and predictable. The lobby hummed with the quiet conversations of successful people conducting business or planning expensive entertainment, the atmosphere enhanced by soft classical music and the gentle sound of the fountain that served as the lobby's centerpiece. Thomas Bear Mackenzie had walked in from the cold Seattle rain, carrying a small duffel bag and a reservation confirmation printed on hotel stationery that he'd carefully preserved during his journey from the veterans' shelter where he'd been staying for the past month. At 71, Thomas moved with the deliberate steps of a man whose body had endured more trauma than most people could imagine, his Marine training still evident in his posture despite the visible effects of age, injury, and decades of difficult civilian adjustment. His appearance told a story that most civilians couldn't read correctly. His jacket, while clean, had been mended multiple times with careful stitching that spoke of resourcefulness rather than poverty. His boots were old but well-maintained, polished with the precision that decades of military discipline had ingrained. His face, weathered by sun, wind, and hardship, carried the quiet dignity of a man who'd faced challenges that would have broken others but had never surrendered his sense of personal honor. To Madison and the other guests in the lobby, Thomas represented exactly the kind of individual who didn't belong in a luxury establishment. His clothes, his age, his careful movements, and his general appearance triggered assumptions about homelessness, mental instability, and potential disruption that made everyone uncomfortable. Several guests moved slightly away from his path, and Madison felt the familiar pressure to act before the situation affected other customers' experience. Thomas approached the reception desk with the reservation confirmation in his weathered hands, prepared for the conversation he'd rehearsed during his walk from the bus stop. He'd saved for 6 months to afford this single night at the Grand Plaza, not for luxury or comfort, but because it held special significance that most people wouldn't understand. 50 years ago, he'd been scheduled to stay at this hotel during a brief leave from Vietnam, a reservation that had been canceled when his unit was deployed for an emergency mission that would change his life forever. "Good evening," Thomas said quietly, placing his confirmation on the marble counter. "I have a reservation under Mackenzie." Madison glanced at the paper without really examining it, her attention focused on Thomas's appearance and the potential problems his presence might create. She could see other guests watching the interaction with varying degrees of discomfort, and she felt the familiar responsibility to resolve the situation quickly and diplomatically. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and a credit card," Madison said, though she'd already decided that she would find a reason to refuse service regardless of what documentation he provided. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting his driver's license and a debit card that he'd specifically requested from the bank to ensure he could complete legitimate transactions. The license was valid, the name matched his reservation, and the card was properly authorized. But Madison barely glanced at the documents before making her decision. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're not going to be able to accommodate you tonight," Madison said, her voice carrying the polite but firm tone she'd been trained to use in difficult situations. "We have concerns about the appropriateness of the accommodation for your needs." Thomas looked at her with confusion and growing understanding. He'd faced this type of rejection countless times since returning from Vietnam, but it never became easier to handle. "Ma'am, I have a confirmed reservation that I paid for in advance. Is there a specific problem with my documentation?" "It's not about documentation," Madison replied, though she realized she was treading into dangerous territory. "It's about ensuring that all our guests have an appropriate experience. This is a luxury establishment, and we have standards that we need to maintain." The conversation was beginning to draw attention from other hotel staff and guests. Thomas felt the familiar mixture of frustration and humiliation wash over him, but his Marine training had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, even when facing adversaries who had advantages he couldn't match. "Ma'am, I understand that you have standards to maintain," Thomas said, his voice remaining calm despite his growing anger. "But I've met all the requirements for my reservation. I've paid in advance, I have proper identification, and I haven't done anything to suggest that I would be inappropriate for your establishment." Madison felt defensive as the situation escalated beyond her comfort zone. She hadn't expected the elderly man to challenge her decision, and his articulate response suggested that he might not be as easily dismissed as she'd assumed. But with other guests watching and her supervisor nowhere to be seen, she felt pressured to maintain her authority. "Sir, I have the discretion to refuse service to anyone who might compromise the comfort and safety of our other guests," Madison said, though she wasn't entirely sure about the legal or corporate policy implications of her statement. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." That's when Thomas made a decision that would change everyone's evening. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, placing it carefully on the marble counter. Inside, nestled in faded purple velvet, was a silver star medal, its ribbon still bearing the colors that had been pinned to his chest by a Marine colonel in a field hospital tent 50 years earlier. Madison stared at the medal, recognizing that it was military but having no understanding of its significance. To her, it looked like costume jewelry, or a replica that homeless individuals sometimes carried to generate sympathy. She didn't know that the Silver Star was the third highest military decoration for valor in combat, awarded only to those who had demonstrated extraordinary gallantry against enemy forces. "This is my Silver Star," Thomas said quietly. "I received it for actions during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, where my platoon was pinned down under heavy enemy fire for 18 hours. I volunteered to cross 200 meters of open ground under constant sniper fire to establish a communication line that allowed artillery support to reach our position. My actions saved 23 Marines who would have died without evacuation support." Thomas opened a second small box, revealing a Bronze Star with V device for valor. "This is my Bronze Star for leading a night rescue mission to extract a wounded reconnaissance team that had been surrounded by North Vietnamese forces. We brought back 4 Marines who would have been captured or killed." He placed a third box on the counter containing a purple heart with 3 oak leaf clusters. "These represent the 4 times I was wounded in combat: shrapnel in my leg during the first tour, gunshot wound to my shoulder during the second tour, and 2 separate explosive injuries during my third tour. I completed all 3 tours because my Marines needed experienced leadership." Madison looked at the medals with growing uncertainty, beginning to realize that she might have made a serious error in judgment. The other guests in the lobby had gathered closer, some recognizing the significance of what they were seeing, others simply curious about the confrontation. Thomas continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded under fire. "I served my country for 8 years, including 3 tours in Vietnam. I've been awarded the Combat Action Ribbon, the Vietnam Service Medal with 4 campaign stars, and the Presidential Unit Citation. I've led Marines in combat, saved lives under enemy fire, and earned these decorations through actions that were witnessed and verified by my commanding officers. He paused, looking directly at Madison. Now I'm asking for a hotel room that I've paid for in advance, with proper reservations and identification. Are you telling me that my service to this country doesn't qualify me to sleep in a bed that I can afford? The lobby had become completely silent as other guests processed what they were hearing. Several people had pulled out their phones, some to record the interaction, others to research the significance of the medals they were seeing. A well-dressed businessman approached the desk, extending his hand to Thomas in introduction. "Sir, my name is Colonel David Harrison, U.S. Army, retired," the man said. "I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I want to thank you for your service. Those are some of the most significant decorations a soldier can receive." Harrison turned to Madison, his expression serious. "Ma'am, this gentleman is a decorated combat veteran whose service record represents extraordinary valor. The Silver Star is awarded for gallantry in action against an armed enemy, and very few people have earned this honor. You're refusing service to a genuine American hero." Madison felt her confidence crumbling as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had rejected not just a customer, but a decorated war veteran whose sacrifices had literally saved lives and whose record of service represented exactly the kind of character that should be honored, not dismissed. "I didn't realize," Madison stammered, though she knew that ignorance didn't excuse her assumptions or her treatment of Thomas. He looked like an older man who didn't spend money on expensive clothes." Colonel Harrison interrupted. "But character and heroism aren't measured by appearance or wealth. This man earned these decorations by risking his life to save others, and he deserves basic respect, not judgment based on your assumptions about who belongs in your hotel." Other guests began approaching the desk, several of them veterans themselves who recognized the significance of Thomas's medals and service record. A Navy SEAL veteran introduced himself and shared his own experiences with civilian assumptions about military service. A Marine Corps mother whose son had served in Afghanistan expressed her outrage at Madison's treatment of someone who had clearly sacrificed for his country. Thomas watched the growing support with gratitude, but also with the understanding that this moment represented something larger than his individual experience. "Ma'am," he said to Madison, "I don't need special treatment because I'm a veteran. I just need the basic respect that any paying customer deserves." But what happened here tonight shows how easy it is for people to make assumptions about others based on appearance rather than character. He carefully returned his medals to their boxes, handling them with the reverence that 50 years of carrying them had instilled. "I earned these decorations in combat, but I didn't earn them for recognition or special privileges. I earned them because my Marines needed someone willing to take risks to keep them alive. The same sense of duty that motivated me then tells me that I need to speak up now, not just for myself, but for other veterans who face these assumptions every day." Madison realized that the situation required more than a simple apology. It demanded a fundamental change in how she approached her job and her assumptions about people. "Mr. Mackenzie, I sincerely apologize for my treatment of you tonight. I made assumptions that were wrong, disrespectful, and completely inappropriate. Would you please allow me to provide you with our best available suite at no charge as an apology for this inexcusable error?" Thomas considered her offer, not because he needed luxury accommodations, but because he recognized the educational value of the moment. "Ma'am, I'll accept a standard room at the rate I already paid, because that's what I reserved and what I can afford. But I'd like you to understand that tonight isn't just about my accommodation, it's about how your hotel treats people who don't immediately appear to meet your expectations." Colonel Harrison stepped forward again. "Mackenzie, with your permission, I'd like to cover the cost of your stay tonight and upgrade you to a suite. It would be my honor to provide this for a fellow veteran who clearly earned far more recognition than he's received." Over the next hour, what had begun as a routine hotel check-in evolved into an impromptu gathering of veterans and supporters who wanted to hear Thomas's stories and understand the experiences that had shaped his life. Madison found herself listening to accounts of combat, sacrifice, and the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life that gave her new perspective on the assumptions she'd made. Thomas shared stories about his 3 tours in Vietnam, the Marines he'd served with, and the actions that had earned his decoration. He explained how combat medics like himself had to make split-second decisions under fire, choosing between their own safety and their responsibility to wounded comrades. He described the 18-hour firefight during the Tet Offensive, when his communication skills and willingness to cross dangerous ground had been the difference between evacuation and catastrophe for his entire platoon. But he also talked about the challenges of coming home to a country that didn't always welcome Vietnam veterans, the difficulty of finding employment when employers were suspicious of military experience, and the decades of struggling with memories and injuries that didn't show on the surface. He explained how many veterans had learned to expect rejection and suspicion rather than recognition and support. The hardest part, Thomas said, isn't the combat or the injuries or even the memory. It's the assumption that because you look different or because you've fallen on hard times, you don't deserve basic human dignity. Tonight wasn't the first time someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong somewhere. It probably won't be the last. Madison listened with growing understanding of how her quick judgment had perpetuated exactly the kind of treatment that made civilian life difficult for veterans. She began to see that her responsibility extended beyond protecting the hotel's atmosphere to recognizing the people whose sacrifices had protected her freedom to work in safety and security. As the evening progressed, hotel management arrived to assess the situation. When they learned what had happened, they immediately offered Thomas complimentary accommodations and committed to implementing new training for all staff members about recognizing and respecting veterans. The hotel's general manager, a former Air Force officer himself, expressed personal regret for the incident and announced that the Grand Plaza would establish a veteran recognition program to ensure that similar situations never occurred again. The story of Thomas Mackenzie's experience at the Grand Plaza spread quickly through social media and local news outlets, becoming a powerful example of how assumptions about appearance could lead to the mistreatment of genuine heroes. The hotel faced criticism for the initial incident, but received praise for their response and commitment to change. Madison underwent additional training about veteran recognition, unconscious bias, and the importance of treating all customers with dignity regardless of their appearance. She learned to identify military decorations, understand the significance of various service awards, and recognize that heroism often comes in packages that don't match civilian expectations. 6 months later, the Grand Plaza had become known as one of the most veteran-friendly hotels in Seattle, offering special rates for military families and hosting events that honored local veterans. Thomas had become a regular guest, not because he needed luxury accommodations, but because the hotel had transformed its culture to reflect respect for service and sacrifice. The silver star that had stopped Madison's rejection now served as a reminder that assumptions about who deserves respect can blind us to the extraordinary people who walk among us, carrying stories of courage that most of us will never fully comprehend. And in the luxury suite where Thomas now stayed when he visited Seattle, a simple plaque reminded every guest that real nobility comes from service to others, not from the ability to afford expensive accommodation. The hotel clerk, who had once seen only a homeless man, now saw a hero whose sacrifices had earned him far more than a hotel room. They had earned him a lifetime of gratitude from a nation that too often forgot to say thank you to the men who had given everything to keep it free. 3 years later, the Mackenzie Initiative, the confrontation that had begun with a hotel clerk's assumptions, had evolved into a nationwide movement that transformed how the hospitality industry treated veterans. The Mackenzie Initiative, named in honor of Thomas's patient dignity during that November evening, had been adopted by over 500 hotels across the country, creating standardized protocols for recognizing and respecting military service members, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Thomas, who had never sought public attention, found himself reluctantly serving as the face of veteran advocacy in the hospitality sector. His quiet demeanor and authentic stories resonated with hotel managers who realized that their staff needed better training to avoid similar incidents. Speaking at industry conferences, Thomas would often begin by saying, "I didn't earn my silver star to get special treatment in hotels. I earned it to protect the kind of country where everyone gets treated with dignity. The Grand Plaza had become the flagship example of veteran-friendly hospitality, not just offering discounts, but creating an atmosphere where military families felt genuinely welcomed. Madison, who had transformed from the incident's antagonist into one of its most effective advocates, now trained hospitality workers across the Pacific Northwest about recognizing the signs of military service and understanding the challenges that veterans faced in civilian settings. Her presentation, titled Beyond Assumptions Serving Those Who Served, included the story of her encounter with Thomas and emphasized how quick judgments about appearance could lead to the rejection of genuine heroes. She often concluded her training sessions by displaying photos of Thomas's medals and saying, "The next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong in your establishment, remember that heroes don't always wear their medals on the outside."